Okay.
Hello?
Hello.
I think we're recording now. Let me get to a position of Roydy. Okay, so how do I have this open so that we're just gonna I'm gonna get the video up so I can show you it. Sectionality. Oh, la, la. Here's the video. Okay, didn't load. What force? I'm gonna cry. Let's search a PDF accent. Let's go on YouTube real quick. 7 minutes to begin. Crazy how this is due May whatever, but I have to do it now because I got training every single day for the rest of my life.
That really sucks.
Express
I'm
yourself.
just gonna get ad going.
Directs thousands of affordable frames.
Skip.
Opportunity for all students, regardless of their identity.
Okay. Minimize that a little bit. All right. Hello, Zoe.
Hello.
So how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Good. Just made breakfast.
Oh, nice. What'd you have?
I had eggs with salmon.
Oh, I don't think I've ever tried eggs with salmon, but I know it's popular.
It's pretty good. Kind of California. So
Yeah.
just tell me a little bit about yourself, how you identify. Just go on
Sure.
yourself a little bit.
Yeah. So my pronouns are she, her. I identify as queer. I work in a nonprofit setting fighting food insecurity on college campuses. Fresh out of college as of a year ago, so haven't been in the working world too long, but
Yeah. So for my feminism class, we learned about intersectionality,
okay.
which goes into depth about just the definition. Professor Kimberly Crenshaw is a huge pioneer for it. And so she writes the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group regarding as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So basically your history, your class, your race, and your gender, your sexuality can all compound into this one kind of interconnected disadvantage that you have. So
Yeah.
for me personally, non-white, although I'm cis, I'm a straight male, um, my history and stuff kind of interconnect to this status of a little bit more disadvantaged than, let's say, a white male, the patriarchy, right?
For sure. Yeah.
And similar to you, queer, non-white. And so one thing that we are going to be kind of going over is just like a few readings that we have that kind of apply to the intersectionality discussion,
Mhm.
and then we'll get into the main topic.
Awesome.
So the first kind of idea that we learned about that I thought was really important was compulsory heterosexuality. And in a reading by Rich, they write an immersive step to take if you consider yourself freely and innately heterosexual. Yet the failure to examine heterosexuality as an institution is like failing to admit that the economic system called capitalism or the caste system of racism is maintained by a variety of forces, including both physical violence and false consciousness. And so that reading kind of goes into how this idea of heterosexuality has pioneered our culture, our policies, and just our society as a whole. Now it's
Mhm.
kind of shoved to the side queer culture, the LGBTQIA, and all disadvantaged peoples. And it's kind of created this disadvantagement to those people. And so the next kind of idea that I wanted to go into was a reading from Cole and Zakaya, which Making Coalitions works solidarity across differences within US feminism. So these authors kind of illustrate feminist activism created through lived experience, lived oppression, experiences resulting in their identities disadvantaging them,
Mhm.
and living in a culture where policies disadvantage those people and those identities.
Yeah.
And then the final one I really think is important to our main discussion is how can I describe privilege? So we talked about white privilege, and a
Mhm.
lot of arguments that came up were, hey, I'm a white male, but I'm poor. I have a single family, I come from a single mother family. But one thing that comes into play is the unconsciousness that no matter all your things that have caused disadvantages to yourself, your skin color hasn't been one of them.
Exactly. Yeah.
And what I see in politics right now is that we have these white male politicians who basically speak for the brown, the gay, the queer, and say, "Hey, I'm just a politician. I'm here to provide my voice," but they speak too much onto these voices without having that voice be part of that cabinet or that Senate or the House.
Yeah.
So in your life, have you kind of experienced politicians, maybe our past administration, who have kind of made you feel lesser as a person?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think my first major experience with that was in college. I attended the University of Connecticut, which is a primarily white college, big school in the Northeast, very rural, relatively conservative. And there were definitely multiple instances of racism on campus that the students, pushed back on as they should, demanded action. And the university administration, which was predominantly white, I think only white, did the classic university. Of course, we, don't stand by this. We're doing an investigation and nothing would ever come out of it. And although I was never directly affected by that, I was never one of those students that experienced discrimination or racism, thankfully. It definitely made me feel like if I ever did, I couldn't go to the administration and say, "Hey, this happened to me. Can I have help?" Because I was physically watching other students who had experienced this, who were very similar to me, fight for their rights, fight for, justice and not get it. And that just made me feel like it wasn't worth it. Like if I were ever to face racism and discrimination to the level that they were, that it wasn't going to be worth fighting against. So that was my first real realization where I was like, okay, I feel like the administration in my life, whether that's college administration or higher than that, legislators, they're not listening to me.
Yeah, that's it. So you said that you haven't personally had any discrimination, but I actually kind of disagree. I think you have personally been discriminated against by that administration. And one thing in our class that we always go off of is the systematic approach and of institutions and how institutions can personally affect people because they create these mandates, these laws, these rules that discriminate against you. And
Yeah.
although they're covered by these kind of fluffy what people want to hear in these identities, they still oppress them to a level. And so
Yeah.
at
Absolutely.
UVM, we have an institution that prides itself on inclusion, acceptance, and anti-racism. Yet the people calling the shots are all mostly white. They're
Yeah.
male. Um,
Exactly.
we do have a new president that isn't white or of that kind of classic patriarchy, but he's still a man and he's making calls for women and queer people. He's straight. So it's kind of that effect. So I'm going to show you a video from Kimberly Crenshaw, if I can get it up. That kind of goes into, let me share my screen. There we go. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, here we go.
And commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which.
All right. So if you heard her, what she was saying is how schools are the forefront of providing inclusion, acceptance, as well as kind of a space for people to discover who they are as a person.
Yeah.
And so our main topic today is the Florida House Bill 1557, which is the Parental Guidance Act, basically. You may have heard it as the Don't Say Gay bill.
Mhm.
So what are your initial thoughts on hearing about that being passed?
Yeah, so I first of all want to preface this with saying that I have not read up on this bill to the extent where I can speak on it as an expert. I don't think a lot of people have, so I definitely want to preface it with that. My initial thoughts after doing some research and some reading up on it is that it operates on the principle that being a member of the LGBTQIA plus community is a choice, because it's giving school parents the right to, introduce LGBTQ topics to their children when they want. And to me, that feels like, well, that's operating off of the notion that it's a choice to be part of this community. So you can choose when to introduce these topics to your children, the later, probably because you don't want them to be introduced to it. So you're choosing to delay it, making sure that the schools aren't going to introduce it for you because you don't want to. And that automatically sets up a really toxic environment for people who are members of the LGBT community, because as we know, it's not a choice. So those were my initial reactions. That was one of the first things that popped into my head was like, hey, wait a minute, this is operating off of the notion that this is a choice. And that's really dangerous.
Yeah, no, it's very dangerous. It's basically saying that your identity, you're choosing to be gay, you're choosing to be Black, you're choosing to be of a community that's disadvantaged.
Yeah. And again, that's not in the bill, obviously, but that's what I feel like that's the base of the bill. That's the laying foundation. And off of that, it's like a snowball effect. If you start by assuming that it's a choice and you write a bill like this, the Parental Rights and Education Bill, is I think its official name, you are already setting up a world of just scenarios that are dangerous to members of the LGBT community as children.
Yeah, and so my initial reactions when I heard about this bill was, let me do some research. I never want to speak on something that I don't really research. So in the research I read, this is not verbatim, it's more of my notes, but essentially the bill would require students to ban the teaching of LGBTQIA topics in the classroom, to not encourage discussions in the classroom, but inadvertently have that at the household level, have the parents understand it. And the bill kind of obviously is ambiguous, but it talks about how up to grade 3, students should not have any exposure to LGBTQIA plus ideas, any teachings about identity, sexual education, or a safe space to talk about identities that they may be questioning. And so, which leaves that burden onto the parents. And that some parents can oppress their children or say that that's wrong. I don't want my children to identify as that, which it's not a choice. You can't have your parents just say, hey, you're going to be straight because I believe that's true. Like, that's
Yeah.
born with it, right? And so another thing that I read is that the bill aims to prohibit classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity. Um, Yet some nuance in that is that the bill doesn't ban those discussions; it just discourages them. Um, and then my most recent research into the bill showed that the vote for it was 75 to 35, 75 in favor, 35 against, and then there was one null vote. And then just researching who voted yes for it, it's predominantly white men talking about these white straight men,
Yeah.
which kind of enforces that our politics are driven by patriarchy
Oh, yeah.
and speak for women, people of color, people who are identified as queer. Um, and so it gets back into the intersectionality thing where how do we have people who don't have these compounding disadvantages make calls for people who do?
Mhm.
And so my initial reactions after researching were that there's a lot in the media, even coining the term "don't say gay." It doesn't say that you can't say gay in the bill, but what it does do is it provides ambiguous language that insinuates that you can't talk about gay people, you can't talk about queers.
And it also just sets the tone, right? Yeah, sure. It doesn't ban the word saying gay. It doesn't technically ban such and such. It just discourages, but it sets the tone. It sets the precedent for where we're headed and for how we're going to treat members of the LGBTQ community as children, as starting as young as kindergarten. Um, so that's also another thing, like bigger picture that this bill is doing that I think is absolutely detrimental to our community. Um, what was I going to say? I'm blanking right now. So you can go ahead, but and it'll come back to me.
Yeah, and so with this subset of politicians who make calls for people who identify as such, it's really showing that no matter what you identify as, it's really up to somebody else. It's
Yeah,
up to someone else's choice, that basically can call like, hey, like there's obviously parents who don't believe in their or don't want their kids to be gay. They understand that they do have disadvantages from color, but there's still this oppression, and it's just like this kind of systemic oppression that translates from the parents to the kid. And schools provide a safe spot for these kids to meet with people who identify similarly, meet with people who identify differently, but in that same kind of category. And it really seems like it oppresses students from discovering who they truly are, or
absolutely.
talking about that.
Yeah. And I've seen it, a big argument in favor of this bill I've seen is like, well, we shouldn't be exposing kids at such a young age to topics of sexuality anyway. They're just kids. They're just kids. And if we were to take that at face value, then we should keep that same energy and apply it to, well, okay, let's not expose them to anything. Let's not expose them to heterosexuality, just sexuality, period. Because you're right, they're just kids. Like, but that's, as we know, being realistic, that's impossible. Our culture, you said yourself that heterosexuality has become institutionalized. It's impossible to just level the playing field in that way. So for that reason, I think that argument is completely invalid, because sure, you can say they're just kids, but you can't apply that to the other side of the argument. You can't apply that to heterosexuality. So that means that we need to have representation for the LGBTQ community, regardless of how young they are, just because of how our system is set up.
Yeah, I think also comments in favor of the bill from speakers like Turning Point USA, PragerU, Candace Owens, and then just Ron DeSantis. Their argument is, I don't want my little child to go to school and learn about sodomy. I don't want them to learn about gay sex. I don't want them to understand these identities that they may fall into. So do you agree that there's a age limit which kids should be exposed to topics like that? Or do you think that it's part of them as an identity, so they should be
I
introduced?
don't think it's who are we to say that there should be a limit as human beings as to when we introduce these topics to children? Like that's just not something that I feel like we can tangibly, measurably set and like have good logic behind it. It doesn't make sense. It does get tricky. I do understand that it's like these are hard discussions. These are like mature discussions. And we are talking about kids in the in reference to this bill specifically. But I do not think there is in any way realistically that we could set a limit that would make sense, right? Because like again, just who are we to say? Who are they to say what let's say like fourth grade. Well, what the fuck makes fourth graders like, mature enough to start learning about gay sex or whatever? One thing I also want to note is that DeSantis said that teaching kindergarten age kids that they can be whatever they want to be is completely inappropriate. Now he's referring to sexuality discussions, right? But that statement as a blanket statement is by nature just completely smothering to identity, period. To erase this notion of you can be whatever you want to be and labeling it as inappropriate just opens an entire wall full, like door, like with all of these problems that could occur, So the fact that he said that, referring to what this bill is inciting, but the fact that he said it as a blanket statement, I just think it's just so clear that there are so many issues.
And that really harkens back to the idea that no matter how much people want change, the patriarchy is going to oppress that change.
Yeah.
They want this reactionary, let's go back to talking about fun things that help kids. Yet what the right always wants is freedom.
Yeah.
How do we have an ecosystem of freedom when we are taking away discussions, remove topics from schools? It's really this juxtaposition of freedom versus this is what I define as education.
Yeah. And I mean, from my perspective, let's think like big picture, right? In a perfect world based on my values, and I understand that my values are different, LGBTQ topics wouldn't even be controversial, right? In a perfect world. The fact of the matter is that they are, unfortunately. Also, in my perfect world, we wouldn't have to expose kids at such a young age to controversial topics because they wouldn't need to worry about them because, they're kids. But again, the reality is that these topics get inserted into kids' lives anyway at such a young age because of social media. Kids are younger and younger, getting phones. So they're just already exposed to these topics. So we need to take both of those facts. One, that it is unfortunately a controversial topic. And two, that kids are being exposed to sexuality and orientation and identity at such young ages. We need to take that into consideration and say, okay, representation matters. We know that representation matters. Racially, sexually, gender identity, representation matters, and we need to apply that to kids. And we cannot, we need to protect the LGBT community and represent them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And when I think about intersectionality, I always think about that history aspect, because of course I can check boxes of race and identity and even gender. Yet what really impacts a child's life is the history aspect. If they live in an ecosystem from kindergarten to third grade, that talking about queer ideas, talking about even topics of their identity is wrong, how are they going to develop as a human later? They're going to think that those ideas are bad. They're going to start hating themselves because they realize that when I was younger, I learned that it was a bad thing. So I'm inherently a bad person.
Yeah.
And it opens up it begs that question of how are they going to react later in life when they start learning, hey, I'm gay, I'm straight, I'm white, I'm black, and realize that some of these aspects or identities of their life are inferior to that precedent that they learned when they were younger.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so it's a really good discussion so far. I really enjoy it. one thing I do also want to go into is the idea of introducing explicit topics to younger kids, because personally I disagree with that. I don't think that a kid should be told about the sex life of the gay teacher. I don't think that they should be exposed to explicit material relating to queer identities. But that is a similarly unfair thing I have as a male. I'm straight, and I'm Christian. So I think that it kind of extenuates the fact that the people who are in charge have those same ideas, but they can't relate to those topics. They don't identify as queer. They aren't Black. Um, and so it's saying it's basically taking that in my, say I'm a white politician right now. They take their past experiences as a good white American boy, and they say that's how everyone should live. That's how everyone should identify. And that's what becomes successful in this world. And so have you seen any notions of that either in your school, in your culture, even at your workplace, that can kind of speak onto that point?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I don't think anybody who is supporting this bill is assuming that, you know, teachers in schools would, you know, if it doesn't pass, will then jump on the opportunity to tell little kids all about their like personal sexual lives and expose them to all of this like graphic content. How I envision this is that, you know, a teacher can be in school and refer to their partner in like passing, you know, if they identify as a woman, be like, oh yeah, like my wife. And that's not a problem. And if a student's like, oh, wait a minute, your wife, like, I've never heard of that before. What is that? Then they can participate in that conversation. That's how I envision like freedom of speech and freedom to talk about these topics playing out at this level. We're talking kids, you know. I don't see this issue, like I don't see, of course, teachers trying to have in-depth conversations about sexuality and sex and queerness to little kids. And I feel like a lot of people feel the same way as me. But I mean, I have already at the college level experienced professors, you know, say in hushed tones, you know, their partner something in reference to their queerness. And that to me, as a queer person, that hurts, you know, to hear their voice drop when they say, oh, my husband, if they're a man, or oh, my wife, if they're a woman. And that's like, oh, it's just a constant reminder of like, oh, we can't be talking about this in school at the college level, you know, and it's a reinforcement, right? And that's what this bill is. It'll just reinforce that idea, that notion of like, oh, hush, hush, we can't talk about this. We can't talk about this. And you're right. There are some topics like that. This is deep. This is mature stuff. And not everyone agrees with it because of religion, because of X, Y, Z. But the fact of the matter is that like, it's here, it's real, and there are people that are being negatively affected by it, and we need to stick up for them and we need to represent them regardless of your beliefs. We can have conversations from two different sides of the table, from two different sides of the spectrum, from two completely different perspectives, and still have real civil conversations where everyone feels seen and heard. And we might disagree, but we feel represented and we feel like, okay, we're getting somewhere. You know what I mean?
I do, yeah. Something that you said that kind of sparks another question is, how important would it have been in your childhood, your college life, to have leaders, professors, teachers, even administrators who are openly gay, who are, I mean, I know you have had a couple teachers like that in the past,
Yeah.
but it's few and far between. So how would your, I guess, comfort in an institution like a college or a high school or an elementary school, how would that have reinforced your sense of belonging and your sense of acceptance in culture?
Yeah. I definitely think it would have affected me. I will say something that was different from when I was in elementary school that you don't see a lot of now, is kids using the term gay as an insult, right? That was still very much a thing when I was a kid. You do see it still now today, but not as much. But I can recall, you know, in elementary school, there would be a girl who was really sporty and tomboy, and people would be like, oh my God, do you think she's a lesbian? You know, that kind of thing. So that's one thing that was present when I was growing up. But I do think if we had more teachers who were openly gay and the conversations were not even necessarily being had, but you felt like you could have them if you wanted to, then first of all, maybe kids wouldn't have been using gay as an insult anyway, because they just would have been more surrounded by people who are like, hey, don't say that, I'm gay. Like, you know, I know you don't mean that. And I definitely think it would have shaped me. I would have, you know, felt more comfortable with my identity long time ago. I mean, I knew I was queer middle school, and probably even earlier, but I didn't know what it meant. That's one thing. That's another thing that I'll say. I feel like there are a lot of kids out there that know that they're different, that maybe even have enough sense to be like, oh, I think I'm queer, but they have no idea what that really means because they don't have representation around them to see like, oh, okay, my teacher is queer, like, and they're just a teacher, they're just a person, and they just have feelings for someone who identifies as the same sex as them. That's all it has to mean. Cool, got it. I think if I had had that much earlier, I would have felt more confident. It would have shaped me into being more confident today. Because even today, I will say, sometimes I engage in conversations about this topic with other people who are either queer or not. It happens with both sides. And I don't feel like I'm well equipped to represent myself as a queer person, because I'm like, wait, I don't even know everything. I don't even have people to look up to. And, you know, and that stems back to as a young kid, as my childhood. So yeah, I definitely think it would have made a difference. Again, not having teachers, you know, talk to me as a kindergartner about what being gay means, but just having them be comfortable enough to be themselves so I can just see that, you know, it's fine. It's all good. You know, it happens, you know, it's normal.
Yeah. And with that, I think you mentioned social media a little while ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think that with this bill passing, it's going to pass. What that burdens a queer student, that burdens a brown student with the task of going out and finding people that they kind of represent with, finding either on social media or in their life. And I don't think students should have that burden of, I mean, elementary students, like, or even high school students, college students, burden themselves with the fact that I need to go find these people because
Yeah.
they're not going to be provided for me in class. I need to go find these topics and talk about these topics either in a hushed tone or in an environment that's not oppressive, rooted in the patriarchy,
Yeah.
to the point where they're doing double time to catch up on their identity. I don't think we should give them that workload of going out and finding people when you have an environment like a school where there's so many people, so many different people. I mean, when was there a school that everyone was the same, right? Never.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely. I mean, it just goes back to what you were saying at the very beginning, where schools are supposed to be a safe space, right? Of learning, of education. That should be inclusive to everyone. And we can argue for days about the nitty-gritty, about what that means, about what topics we should be introducing. Well, what discussions should we actually be having? You know, what conversations should and shouldn't be at school? We can get into that. And that's all important stuff. But at the end of the day, it's about representation. It's about having the right to get an education that represents you. And that includes the people around you having the right to be themselves and talk about themselves, you know, to their comfort level.
yeah. And with that, it's the fact that the right says that finances, math, science, English, all these core educational values are more important to a student developing than learning about their identity, which comes back to the fact that although these topics will set this student up for success in the future, how can they learn about these topics when they don't feel comfortable about themselves? Like
Yeah.
it comes to the personal level. It's all students are people, right?
Yeah.
So we can't just cater them to a life of success, because success never happens if you're not comfortable with your identity yourself,
Absolutely.
and you start fearing the people in power because they've oppressed you for so long.
Yeah. And I will just another thing to add for those who are arguing, well, school should be a place of just learning. We should go to school, we should learn about math and science and English. We don't need to talk about identity at all. Well, the reality is that again, identity is just inserted into our education everywhere. Even, just separation of church and state, that doesn't happen in school. We see that with what we are taught in our history books, in our science books,
Pledge of
every
Allegiance.
yeah, it's just like that's not the reality. Education is so much more than just school subjects. So I think that argument is invalid, and I think we need to embrace that and be like, education is so much more than just a science lesson. Yeah, it's not going to be just going to school to learn about X, Y, and Z subject. You're going to learn about other human beings. You're going to learn about the people around you, and you're going to learn about yourself. So that's what I would say to those arguing for this bill, saying, well, school just needs to be a place of learning. We'll define learning, and let's pick that apart, and let's see that learning is so much more than what you're saying it is.
Yeah, no, that's a great thing. And I think that they also kind of get muddled in that idea that we don't want to talk about identity, we don't want to talk about sexuality,
Right.
or any of the things related to gender, sexuality. But then you hear these teachers who are like, what do you want to be when you're older? And you hear firefighter, doctor, lawyer, policeman, but how impactful would it be to be like, I want to be a gay fireman, or I want to have a husband, or I want to have a wife, or I want to have, you know what I mean? It's a plethora of stuff that I think should be introduced to kids at a younger level, because it's their life, it's their identity. I mean, you're not catering this person to a success on Wall Street. You just want them to be successful in life. Like kindergarten, and I would argue second and third grade, have not too much to do with academics as much as finding yourself.
Yeah. Socialize.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point.
So any final topics that you want to talk about with Don't Say Gay bill, House Bill 1557 rather, or intersectionality, or anything about life that you want to talk about?
I think I'm good for the Don't Say Gay bill. Like I said, I will not pretend to be an expert on the nitty gritty of this bill, but I definitely want to start having more conversations about it and speaking up about it. So thank you for inviting me to do this. This was a great experience for me to just keep that conversation going. But yeah, I mean, it's all connected, and with intersectionality, it's something that I think, if anything, just needs to be talked about more by everyone of every walks of life, and keeping in mind that representation matters.
And so just for some transparency, I didn't choose you because you're my sister or because we're close or anything. Specifically, I mean, that definitely helped out.
Yeah.
But I think that you'll see that this in Washington or in Florida, the House, is that people have these discussions, but they don't include people who identify or who are oppressed by these laws. It's this kind of this subcategory, this echo chamber of white male, white privilege, secular topics, and no groundbreaking measures are taken because everyone agrees or everyone supports it.
Absolutely. And I think that's why I've been afraid to be a part of these discussions sometimes. I recognize that I am the perfect candidate in a lot of ways as a queer woman of color, but have been raised in an extremely privileged environment, which in my mind, and this is all just in my head, has made me feel like I don't have a right to be at this table, because have I really suffered? So thank you for bringing it, keeping me focused on the fact that, well, I'm still a minority, and that's valid. And regardless of any struggles that might come financially that I haven't had, I'm still going to struggle as a queer woman of color, and I deserve a place at this table, and I deserve to have my voice heard. So that's something that I also am taking away from this, and I need to keep having these conversations regardless of my experiences.
Awesome. All right. Well, that should wrap up the podcast, but thank you for joining today. And yeah, I'll get this out to you later.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, see you, Zoe.
Bye.